In trying to figure out the appropriate way to manage for an appropriate situation, a lot of managers get very caught up in how they should act. Should they smile? Should they be nasty? Should they be autocratic? Instead of really worrying about what's the appropriate way to organize and process work with our group for a particular situation. In other words, you don't want to be participative all the time. There are times where autocratic management is very appropriate. But don't think that autocratic management just means nasty management. It simply means organizing work in a way that looks like this, with the boss in the middle. Let's take a surgeon, for example. They're known for being autocratic and nasty, but I'm sure there are surgeons somewhere who are meek and mild-mannered and very polite. But you probably want them all to act the same way, especially when they're looking down at your gallbladder. You want your surgeon, no matter how polite or how nasty, to say to his OR nurse, "Scalpel," and not stop and say, "Or do you think it should be a clamp?" And wake up the anesthesiologist and say, "Max, how do you feel about clamps? How's morale in the OR?" while you bleed on the floor. The reason that that style of management is so appropriate, it's because the surgeon is doing the cutting. You see, it's his hands or her hands that are in there with the blood and the gore, not theirs. These people work for the surgeon. We know how good the surgeon is by counting the number of patients who walk out of the hospital. But the trouble with being a chief of surgery, being a manager of surgeons, the trouble with managing anybody is that you're no longer doing the cutting. You see, now they're doing the cutting. It's going on out here. And for the first time, your success, your reward, your career really depends as a manager on how well you can get those people to work for you. And now for the first time comes a stark new realization that every young manager faces for the first time. For the first time we realize we work for them. I would argue that your best bosses did that to you, that you have a model, that you don't need theory. Would you think for a minute of the best boss you ever had? I often ask that question. I always get more or less the same kind of answers. When I ask about best bosses, people say, well, my best boss left me alone. What they also say is, my best boss trusted me. My best boss delegated. And then in the same breath, they go on to say, my best boss supported me. My best boss backed me up. My best boss gave me feedback. Well, what kind of feedback did you get from your best boss? Chances are it was positive and negative feedback. So there's an interesting dichotomy. Best bosses don't leave us alone. They're involved with us, they structure, they provide feedback, they set objectives and targets. They aren't separate and distinct from us. They are facilitators. They help us become more productive. Well, that's what participative management is really all about. First thing, let me say, is that participative management is not management by democracy. We're not going to suggest that you go down and get your folks together and vote to see if you'll sell products or make goods today. You'll lose the election every time. We are simply talking about permitting the people who work for you, just the way your best boss did, to influence the design of systems that affect them. Why do you want to do that? Why do you want to let people influence? Because you can double dip. Because first of all, people want to influence the design of systems that affect them. People want to have some control over their environment rather than be jerked about by the winds of change or by management. Second of all, you need their input for decision making. If you buy the idea that some of them may very well be smarter than you. Remember, the charge of the Light Brigade was ordered by somebody who didn't know the territory. Let's at least go out there and talk to people who know more about their work than we know about their work. It's interesting to see in all of American industry that this basic idea of tapping into consultants who are already on your payroll still isn't generally accepted. I recently read a letter to the editor in the Los Angeles Times. It was written by an automobile worker who had just been laid off. He'd been laid off because he said that he felt the American consumer wasn't happy with the quality of the products in his automobile factory. And he said, but you know, it really isn't the worker who's to blame for the lack of quality in products, it's management. And then he said, the worker who performs a certain task 320 times a day, 5 days a week for 16 years, knows more about the specifics of that job than anyone else. That seems to make sense to me. He then said, but in 16 years I have never been consulted. I've never seen any other assembly line worker consulted on how to improve a job qualitatively or quantitatively. It isn't just assembly line workers who aren't consulted, it's most people in organizations. People who would like to participate if management would let us in. The motto of Dartmouth College is Vox Clementes in Deserto, a voice crying out in the wilderness. I hear voices crying out in the wilderness all the time. In fact, that's how I make my money. I listen to the voices of your people who want to participate, who want to influence the design of systems that affect them if only management would let them. For example, a few years ago, I was hired by a firm who had a problem. Their division of heavy-duty air conditioning was going out of business. It was the most poorly organized, poorly managed thing that I'd ever seen, and apparently that they had ever seen, and they couldn't get their act together. So they wanted to hire consultants who would help them do that. I had a team of people who worked with me, and we went around the country interviewing and talking to people, trying to get some information so we could offer our recommendations as to how to improve the whole operation. After a few weeks went by, I found myself out on the West Coast. Now, in the process of negotiations, the president of the company said, make sure that you stop, if you're out west, in Phoenix, Arizona, because we have a bright young man there, and perhaps he could contribute. By the time I got to Los Angeles, I was finished. I knew what was wrong with that company. All I wanted to do was fly back to Boston where I started, type up the report, and send it to management along with the bill for $70,000. But I promised I'd stop in Phoenix, so I stopped at the airport restaurant, met him. I didn't even have to go into town. I was just switching planes. The bright young executive came out, and I said, tell me what's wrong with your territory. He said, I don't want to talk to you about my territory. I want to talk to you about what is wrong with this company. And he took out a paper napkin, and in the airport restaurant, he proceeded to outline everything that I had in my briefcase. In fact, he had a few more things that I never thought of. As he was writing on the paper napkin, I suddenly realized that he was creating a $70,000 napkin. When he finished, I picked up his $70,000 napkin and I looked at it and I said, have you told this to anyone else? With my heart pounding through my tie. And I'm older now, I'm wiser now. I shouldn't have been surprised when he said yes. 2 years ago, I wrote this all out and sent it to New York, where the headquarters was. I never heard anything. Last year, I was in New York at an annual meeting, and I asked the vice president, what do you think about my plans to improve operations? They thanked him politely, went out and hired a consulting company for $70,000, lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in the meantime, simply because they had no way of listening to that person. Organizations that tap into that resource, their own people, see dramatic results. See, participative management pays off. My accountant says there are two ways that I can improve the profitability of my company. I can raise the bridge, or I can lower the river. For example, we were engaged recently by a major corporation, a Fortune top 500 company, to institute an employee involvement program. But before we started, the president of the corporation wanted to make sure that he and I were on the same wavelength, philosophically. And he said, hey, consultant, is it possible for an organization to improve productivity 25% without investing one new capital dollar? And I said, yes. And I was all set to tell him more stories about how we've seen this happen in the past. And he said, never mind, you passed the test. And I said, what's the test? He said, I just want to make sure that you appreciate the fact that this stuff we are about to do works. Because last year, in 4 of our plants, we increased productivity an average of 31%, simply by changing our management practices, simply by getting our managers to start to listen to the people who worked for them. Let's take a look at how one manager deals with a problem by involving his folks in a participative management dialogue.
Yeah, I get the picture. No, I didn't realize that the inventory situation was that bad. Of course, we'll do everything that we can. Friday? No, I need more time. I mean, all right. Talk to you on Friday. Just what I need right now. Inventory problems. Okay, I can deal with this. Let's see, where are those figures from last month? Bob must have those. Well, how about the forecasts? Randy must have those. Wait a second. If they have all the information, why am I trying to be a hero and do it myself? I think this is a good time to get everyone together and get some fresh ideas. Bob, what are you doing for lunch this afternoon? So that's the story. Jack wants an answer by Friday.
Friday. And look, Tom, no offense, but you usually handle these kind of things yourself. What exactly do you want from us? I mean, we're pretty busy.
I know you're busy, but I need a solution that we can all buy into, and I need it right away. Now, this is an important problem. You people have most of the information that give us a clue to the solution. I need your help on this one, Red. Do you have any idea how we might have gotten into this situation?
Actually, I've been doing a lot of thinking about this since I worked on the forecast. The new computerized inventory control system is a great system, but there are a few problems.
Go ahead, Randy. Let's hear your ideas.
Okay. If you look at the inventory from the last quarter...
When do you want to do that? When do you want to get people together to let them influence the design of systems that affect them? When you want to manage change. When you don't know the best answers either. When you want consensus and commitment from the people who work for you. That's an ideal time for participative management. But you don't need to do it all the time. When you decide that it's appropriate to use some kind of participative management technique, remember a few basic rules. You want to make sure that there's a firm, structured, psychological contract. Sometimes you have to be tough to be a good participative manager. You've got to let them know that you want and you need their input, but you may not buy everything they say. You win some and you lose some. Indeed, not everyone wants to participate. Sometimes you have to reach out and grab people by the throat and drag them into the process simply because you need their input. When you do bring people together, make sure that they can contribute. For example, it probably will do very little good to bring a bunch of housekeeping personnel together and ask whether or not you should open up a new operation across town. But you may want to bring them together and ask, how are you going to clean the new operation across town? The job of management is to define what has to be done. How it's done is often something that you can push down on the people who know more about that than you do. One fellow I know runs an engineering company, but he's not an engineer. For the last 15 years, people have been coming to him with technical problems. And every time two engineers come into his office asking for a decision, that he, the boss, makes the decision, he always says, if you two engineers can't resolve this problem, I, the boss, will make the decision. Of course, I have no idea what you're talking about, but I'll make the decision. And he said in 15 years, he's never had an engineer take him up on it. They always say, no, thanks, we'll get back to you. So what you're really trying to do with participative management is to push responsibility back down in certain areas, but not all the areas of work that you're responsible for. One writer talked about and asked the basic question, who's got the monkey? What he said was that for many years he realized that people were coming into his office, usually on Friday afternoons, and it was as if they had a monkey on their back, and they dumped the monkey onto his desk by saying, boss, do we have a problem? And he said over the weekend he'd come in and he'd find all of these monkeys on his desk, and after a while he'd look outside and he'd see his own employees out on the golf course playing golf, while he was sifting and sorting through the monkeys they had deposited on his desk. He said he finally got smart one day when somebody came in and said, boss, do we have a problem? Before he could offload the monkey, he said, you sure do. Perhaps that's not a bad philosophy for all of us. Let's make sure that when people leave your office, that the monkey of responsibility that they can contribute to is planted firmly and squarely right between their shoulder blades. Let's spend some time now and see how to do this thing called participative management.